Hello, everyone. Dan here. I'm going to be talking about Performance Matters and the ongoing video game voice acting strike, mostly explaining some things that people seem to have a lot of misconceptions on and addressing many of the criticisms I've seen against it. The ongoing video game strike between SAG-AFTRA and 11 publishing companies has gone on for like 130 days or so by the time I've made this recording. Now, if you really haven't heard about that, or even a little surprised that it's still going on, I really don't blame you. There really hasn't been a lot of coverage on this issue at all, and finding relevant information has been rather tricky. I mean, hell, if you just look up the Performance Matters hashtag or just try Googling it, you'll end up with everything from weird corporate programs to help teachers to people trying to sell you sportswear to pictures of Beyonce at the Grammys for some reason. I don't know who came up with the hashtag, but to be frank, it's not been very good. It also doesn't help that there are a lot of major misconceptions and misinformation that a lot of people just kind of take at face value. Frankly, I'm just kind of sick of the whole situation, so I want to make a video to just kind of talk about the issue informatively, break it all down, and address many of the thoughts and criticisms I've seen online. Let me first start off with some full disclosure, however. I'm an aspiring voice actor myself. Of course, obviously I'm not union. So, naturally I do have a bit of a bias in this situation. I also take acting lessons from Crispin Freeman. You might know him as the voice of Winston, or Alucard, or Prince Turnip. He's also part of the negotiating committee on behalf of SAG-AFTRA in this matter. Please note that this whole video is my thoughts, not his. He was just kind enough to answer one or two questions for me. So take from all of that what you will. Now, if you're not familiar with Performance Matters or any of the particulars of the strike, here's a quick rundown. SAG-AFTRA is a union that represents actors, voice actors, stunt people, DJs, puppeteers, basically a whole lot of different professions in the professional entertainment industry. They have been working out a new interactive contract with the video game industry since the previous one has expired, negotiating with 11 video game publishers at the start of 2015. Those publishing companies are Electronic Arts, Activision, Take-Two, VoiceWorks Productions, WB Games, Blind Light LLC, Disney Character Voices Incorporated, Insomniac Games, Interactive Associates Incorporated, Corps of Discovery Films, and Formosa Interactive. When the existing contract expired, it became known as what is called an open contract, which essentially means it's still in effect, but a new contract can now be negotiated to replace it. Keep in mind that that previous original contract was first penned back in 1994. The video game industry has changed quite a bit over the last 20 years or so, not the least of which is how much more voice acting and storytelling has, just become much more sophisticated and increased in general since the days of games like, Shaq Fu. Anyway, negotiations to work out a new contract were started back in early of February of 2015. However, over the last 2 years, talks have generally broken down, with very few agreements being met on many of the major issues SAG-AFTRA has. Those 4 biggest sticking points are as follows. 1. Shorter shouting sessions that are at a maximum of 2 hours long instead of the usual 4 hours. 2. Having trained stunt coordinators be present for motion capture work to prevent injury. 3. Greater transparency in auditions and productions so that actors have a greater understanding of their role. And finally, 4. Secondary compensation based on game sales. Now, I want to talk about that last one first, mostly because this seems to be like the major thing people disagree with and also has the most misconceptions around it. What SAG-AFTRA is looking for is called a performance bonus, which has the voice actors of a given game get bonus pay whenever a game sells a certain amount of copies. Specifically, what's on the table is that voice actors in a game would make an extra session fee of about $825 for every 2 million copies of a game sold or subscriptions bought, with a self-imposed cap of 8 million copies sold. So, you might be wondering, are they asking for royalties? No, not quite. It's more of a bonus, and that's a big difference, and it's a major misconception people have regarding this whole strike. You see, the way traditional royalties work is that you would be paid a certain percentage based on sales from the first unit sold of something on until perpetuity, or until your contract says you don't get any more. For example, say that you were in a movie, and you got paid for your role in that movie. Now, let's say that same movie has gone to DVD. The way traditional royalties would work is you would get paid a percentage of the DVD sales. That is not what SAG-AFTRA is looking for in this case. Let me repeat that again so it's very, very clear to anyone listening. SAG-AFTRA is not looking for royalties in video games in this matter. The people on the negotiating committee understand that video games are different than television or cinema, and the whole traditional royalty based on percentage sales really wouldn't work very well for anyone. Instead, the performance bonus is based off of what they would call a shared prosperity model, meaning secondary compensation would trigger at increasing tiers of sales, in this case for every 2 million copies or subscriptions sold up to 8 million. Why every 2 million? That's usually when these big AAA games start to really make some bank. As I understand it, the going rate for a union voice actor in a video game would be about $825 a session, which is usually around 4 hours long. The proposal from SAG-AFTRA would in effect give an actor a maximum of $3,300 for a wildly successful game that sold at least 8 million units. Now, that's a lot of money we're talking about. 825, 3,300. These are some pretty big numbers that I'm just kind of casually dropping down. And it is. But at the same time, you also have to have a little bit of perspective here. These are the biggest of the AAA publishers and the biggest games we're talking about. Most games wouldn't even have triggered at the 2 million mark. I mean, heck, back in 2015, only 3 games from all of these publishers would have theoretically triggered at all, those being Call of Duty Black Ops 3, Star Wars Battlefront, and Madden NFL 16. The bonus payouts to talent would be comparatively negligible to what these games make. Let me run some numbers using some real-world examples to kind of give you an idea, and we'll use this handy document someone else made that I'm stealing for the purpose of this video. There'll be a link in the description. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater sold about 3.7 million copies, earning about $222 million, assuming the game sold for $60 each. So, under SAG-AFTRA's proposed model, it would do the first trigger at the 2 million copies sold, giving the voice cast an additional $825 each. Now, according to IMDb, Metal Gear Solid 3 had 27 English cast members and 25 Japanese cast members. Now, I really don't know how Japanese voice acting works or how their market is, and I don't think that they would be included under a SAG contract like this, but for the sake of argument, let's say they are. Let's give the benefit of the doubt to the publishers and just make it as bad for them as possible. So that would mean you would have a cast of 52 people, each getting $825, which would equal about $42,900. Now, if you compare that to what the game made, $222 million, that is 0.0001% 19324 324 324 repeating of the generated revenue that that game made that would have gone to the actors. It should be noted that many people criticize that voice acting makes up such a very small part of the development of a game. Scott Whitland, who represents the video game publishers during the negotiations, has been quoted as saying that voice actors represent less than 1/10 of 1% of the work that goes into making a video game. But, according to these numbers, it would seem that SAG-AFTRA is actively fighting to just earn 1/10 of 1/1000th to get the kind of compensation that this would include. Let's use another example, this time Grand Theft Auto 5. Remember that GTA 5 is one of the best-selling video games of all time. The only games that have outsold it are Tetris, Minecraft, and Wii Sports. That's it. At around the 2014 holiday season, it had sold over 40 million copies, earning around $2.4 billion. $2.4 billion. And I don't have to assume that game for $60 because it still sells for $60. Now, the cast in GTA 5 is a bit of an interesting case because they have quite a bit of celebrity talent. There are people like Dane Cook and Adam West and a whole bunch of other names. They wouldn't necessarily apply to the proposed contract from SAG-AFTRA because more likely than not, these kind of companies would approach these people directly and work out a private contract, usually with a bit more money and compensation. But again, let's say that they would be included, that we just make the worst case scenario possible for the publisher just to make a point. So, according to IMDb, that means the game had about 840 actors. Now, a cast of 840 people, each being paid $825, is about $693,000. Since GTA 5 hit the top tier mark at 8 million copies sold, that's the maximum number of bonus payouts. Multiply that number by 5, which would be the first session and the 4 maximum bonuses, and you get $3,465,000 that went to the cast. That is an impressive amount of money for the voice acting cast in a video game, but again, you need to keep a little perspective here. This was one of the best-selling games of all time, making nearly $2.5 billion in 2014. Divide how much money voice actors made, and it comes to just 0.144375%. Now, the point of all that number crunching is that even if you had a ridiculously huge cast of voice actors for one of the best-selling video games of all time, and it hits the maximum tier for bonus payouts that SAG-AFTRA is looking for, it's just a fraction of a 1/10 of a percentage. SAG-AFTRA is literally just asking for a pittance. GTA 5 has since sold 70 million copies. You can do the math on that. Now, the next major sticking point in this strike is the idea of transparency. What voice actors are looking for is less obfuscation when it comes to auditioning for games or during production. It's been very common for voice actors during an audition or a recording session, and they be provided with little to no information, such as who their character is, what their character is, what kind of setting is it, who are they talking to, etc., etc. All of the very, very basic information of who, what, where, that every actor needs to do a competent performance and make strong acting decisions. Most of the time, you only have your lines, so you can't infer any information from any dialogue from anyone else, because you don't have any dialogue from anyone else. Many times, voice actors aren't told the title of the game that they're working on, even after the game's been released, or if it's a game that's a sequel to a franchise that they've been in before. There's been a number of instances where they've only found out that they were in a game because fans sought them out and told them. On top of all that, actors don't know if the project might have any objectionable content that they might not want to be a part of, like a sex scene, or strong racial slurs, or weird political ideology, or some other unpleasant thing that they might not necessarily want to be a part of. It's an actor's prerogative to decide if they want to be on a project or not. I know of one instance where the very talented voice actress Grey Griffin, after giving birth to her second child, auditioned for a role she was given no information on, only to discover that she was playing a baby-eating demon. Jay Britton auditioned for a role, and the only instruction he was given was to use a British accent for his lines. He didn't really have much to go on with that, so he kind of leaned toward a Father Christmas type, only later to find out that he was auditioning for Gandalf. There's a ton of stories like these, and it's mind-boggling. The publishing companies argue that because of the competitive nature of the video game industry, they need to keep information on their games as secret as possible. Now, to their credit, that makes perfect sense from a business standpoint, and there has been precedent of leaks in the past. But here's the thing, leaks happen at all levels of video game development, be it intentionally or unintentionally. Copyright filing for a new IP, leaked scripts, the hiring of new people, something the head of the company let slip during an interview, disgruntled ex-employees. The list goes on all the ways information can just kind of find its way out into the wild. It's rather unfair to single out voice actors for being the only culprit. Also, this is exactly what non-disclosure agreements are for, to let people handle sensitive information like this with, binding legal action. Most voice actors who do this kind of work are somewhat professional, and the ones who don't, who do blab on social media and let things out, they don't work again. No one wants to work with someone who can't be trusted. It does not seem unreasonable to me to have voice actors sign an NDA after being cast for a role, or just before an audition, which SAG-AFTRA is open to doing. It's on the table. This is also very standard practice in just about every other form of professional acting. But these companies refuse, and they have continued to refuse on this for about 2 years. Finally, the last two reasons for the strike are actually very straightforward safety issues. Shorter sessions with shouting, and stunt coordinators for motion capture. SAG-AFTRA is asking that overly strenuous sessions that require a lot of yelling, screaming, or other damaging vocalizations be kept to a maximum of 2-hour sessions, and that the actor not lose any pay for the shorter session. As you can probably guess, video games often have a lot of shouting and violent efforts that put strain on the throat and voice. Many voice actors simply refuse to do video game work at all because they know how damaging it is. There's been a number of cases of people bleeding from the throat, yelling so loud for so long that they throw up, people passing out, people doing permanent damage to their range, and people needing surgery to remove throat nodes or nodules or pustules or something else. It's honestly gotten so bad, SAG-AFTRA has asked OSHA to take a look at these working conditions. As for having a stunt coordinator on set for motion capture work, there's been a number of injuries where actors were told to do things that were unsafe or risky, or that they simply might not have had any training in whatsoever. A professional stunt coordinator would go a long way to preventing any kind of injury and preventing these kind of incidents from happening. And again, this is all very standard stuff in the entertainment industry. The game companies refuse on both parts, offering to have the strenuous sessions simply broken up into 2-hour sessions within a few days of each other, and arguing that motion capture work isn't really acting, so they really shouldn't have to follow basic acting safety practices in the industry. You really just have to appreciate how companies can be so determined to cut corners and find loopholes over basic safety issues. This is all very standard stuff and should be a non-issue, but these companies have refused to budge in negotiations over this since the start of 2015. over basic safety. I want to wrap up this video by going over a number of arguments and criticisms I've seen against the strike in the union. One I really noticed the most is that people say that developers contribute far, far more than voice actors do to a game, and that they get much worse conditions and treatment. Even the lowest level playtester will put in more hours than a voice actor will. Why should they get anything when developers don't? Well, I do agree with a lot of that. The video game industry is plagued at almost all levels of developers working 80, 100-hour weeks on unpaid overtime, sleeping and living in their offices, losing quality of life, missing out on friends, family, as their jobs just consume their lives to reach completely unrealistic deadlines or to appease a demanding publisher. This has honestly gotten so bad it's led to a number of lawsuits in the past against publishers like EA. But it's still fairly common practice, this whole culture of crunch time. So if anyone should be getting extra money and better treatment, it should be developers, right? Yeah, I think so. And the people at SAG-AFTRA think so. Most voice actors, at least the ones who work at this level, know many of the people on development teams personally and usually have a good insight on to their working conditions. But there are two important facts to keep in mind here. Firstly, actors have a union. Most professions in entertainment do. Developers, be they programmers, playtesters, riggers, asset designers, or any of the other technical or creative jobs that I really don't know the names of or how any of them work, they're not organized at all, as far as I know. It's hard to get better working conditions and benefits when you're essentially alone. This is a large part of the reason why groups like SAG-AFTRA are formed in the first place. Secondly, developers do get bonuses on successful titles. Sometimes. However, these are not tied to sales, but rather to critical scores and reviews, usually through something like Metacritic. I really don't think that's a good system, though. You could have made the best game in a franchise and have it sell extremely well, but since you only earned an 84 instead of an 85, you don't really see a dime in compensation. That's what happened with Obsidian and Fallout New Vegas, and given the history of a number of game companies doing some questionable, shady business practices to manipulate reviews in the past on a number of sites, it would be in the best interest for developers to earn a bonus the way SAG-AFTRA is demanding now for actors. You think maybe part of the reason these publishers are refusing to agree on bonuses based on sales might have something to do with preventing developers from asking just that in the future? That if SAG-AFTRA were to win here, it would set a precedent and maybe motivate people in the video game industry to demand better instead of just accepting the status quo? That maybe this billion-dollar industry is scared of people who do most of the work from forming a union? Maybe. I don't really have concrete proof on that, but that's pretty sound reasoning. I think the problem here is the video game industry is so full of exploitation. Developers are exploited to work long, hard hours, often without overtime, without the reassurance of a bonus, even if their work is great. Many sign non-disclosures and can't publicly speak out against many of the issues that they have with their job without risk of being fired or facing legal action. And even if they do everything they're told, there's a good chance they'll be fired anyway when the game's done, as the company will undergo some restructuring and replace many of the burnt-out employees with a bunch of fresh grads. Comparatively, voice actors don't work as long, but risk personal injury, be it bleeding from the throat, screaming so loud you pass out, swinging from the rafters for motion capture, or just straining yourself in a session that it requires surgery to fix your throat. Ultimately, Performance Matters is not an actor versus developer issue, though many people think it is at first glance. You really have to take a moment to understand how crazy that kind of doublethink is. People shouldn't support voice actors because developers have it so much worse. So we should support publishers who make things worse for developers in the first place. If game developers were to organize and demand better, I could almost guarantee SAG-AFTRA would support them, just as the Teamster Union, or the Musicians Guild, or the Animation Guild is supporting them right now, or how SAG stood with the writer's strike that happened about a decade ago. If any of you saw the Game Awards, you might have remembered when Nolan North went on stage to accept his award for Nathan Drake in Uncharted 4, and he praised the work of developers over at Naughty Dog and downplayed his own contribution. Most people in publications thought he was throwing the union under the bus with those words, that he was some kind of outlier speaking out against the strike. But that's not all the case. All of his colleagues only praised him for honoring the people who worked so hard on Uncharted during his own award. Voice actors do have the benefit of getting some recognition, but unless your name is Kojima or Schafer, developers are unlikely to get on a stage and be given an award for their work. Mr. North was trying to share in the glory with the people at Naughty Dog he's been working with for over a decade. Though, admittedly, the way he said it was rather awkward and had people confused. Another argument I often see is no one buys a game for its voice acting or its cast. No one goes out of their way to buy a game just because a certain voice actor is in it. That I do agree with for the most part. I'm a big fan of voice acting, but the only game I can honestly say that motivated me to buy it just for its voice cast was Batman Arkham City. I've honestly never heard of anyone who plays games just for voice acting. The mechanics of games, the things that actually make a game a game. These are what interest people. Given we all have different tastes and look for different things in our gaming experience, be it the mechanics or the graphics or whatever, but for the most part I would agree that voice acting does take a backseat to more important things on what makes a game good. Good voice acting won't actually make a bad game good, and poor voice acting won't necessarily ruin an otherwise good game. That being said, it should be noted that many of the best-selling games today do have voice acting, and those actors are union. So there is some correlation between voice acting and sales. Now, before you point out all of the great selling games that have no voice acting or bad voice acting, please keep in mind that the terms of this contract aren't retroactive and affect games made in the past, but about the future of games, and they also really wouldn't affect smaller indie development. This is about the future of the industry. Most big budget games today have extensive voice work, and given the increasing trend in narrative in games, that's only going to go up. I mean, for God's sake, Fallout 4 had more dialogue in it than Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas combined. And even if you really don't care about voice acting in games at all, that doesn't diminish the work people put into it. I know many people who don't listen to the sound of games at all, but just listen to their own music playlist. Does that mean the people who made the original soundtrack deserve nothing? Just because you skip a cutscene doesn't nullify the effort and creative work the people who rigged that cutscene put in. Besides, if voice acting really did not matter at all, these big companies wouldn't be shelling out big sums of money to get people like Kit Harington or Peter Dinklage or someone else from Game of Thrones. And not to get all pretentious about the art of games, but financial success is not the only indicator on whether a game was good or not. If it was, No Man's Sky was a runaway success, having made over $40 million. Yeah, No Man's Sky made over $40 million, and that's after the backlash and the refunds. Another argument I see is people question, won't SAG-AFTRA's demands drive up the price of games? It shouldn't. The secondary compensation would only trigger for games that are doing rather well, and that would also be done after sales, not during the production and eating up the budget. Basic safety practices would make work get done better and faster, which would save money in production and time. Greater transparency in projects would better inform actors so that they could nail their role faster, which would cost the company less in sessions. Also, I think it should be noted that these companies don't necessarily have a track record of needing to find an excuse or justification to rise the price of games. Another argument I often see is, won't they just hire non-union actors to replace the union actors? A lot of people hate hearing the same voice actors all the time. Now some fresh blood can get a chance. Well, being a non-union voice actor myself, I can kind of understand that reasoning. But there's some things you have to keep in mind on why that really wouldn't work out very well. Most of these companies hire out of the LA market, since that's where most of the acting industry is. Sometimes they do go to San Francisco because that's a bit closer to Silicon Valley, but most of the time they will stick to the LA market. And most of the working talent in LA is usually union. Even if you were to find non-union people, their ability and professionalism may not be up to the demands of the project, so they'll have to drag a performance out of you, which will only cost these companies more money and time on sessions, or rehires, or replacements. And chances are, people aren't going to want to work with you in the future as an actor if you're scabbing during a strike. The voice acting community is relatively small. Word gets around. Even if you were to use a pseudonym or a stage name, people will recognize your voice. One argument I actually find kind of funny is, well, we don't need voice acting, we'll just go back to text-based games. I mean, really? Really? Do you really think that's going to happen? Do you really think the next big Call of Duty is going to drop a big JRPG-style text box on you every time someone screams out grenade or something? The fact of the matter is, most of these AAA games have extensive voice acting in them, even if you don't notice it. Many genres simply don't do well with just text. Now, don't get me wrong, text-based games are great. I've recently gotten back into Stardew Valley, and that's all dialogue boxes. Voice acting in that game for the characters, might be nice, but the game's not hurting without it. And finally, the last argument I often see is simply, no one cares. This is the second longest actor strike in SAG history, and yet support from fans or just basic coverage has kind of dwindled over time. Only a few publications have reported on it, and not always in a positive or even basically researched light. Many people who talked about this issue in the past, including #1 kissy boy Jim Sterling, has been oddly quiet ever since the strike started. Even SAG-AFTRA itself had only the odd picket every month or so. I think a lot of people just don't care, be it that they've just hand-waved away the whole issue as just a bunch of greedy actors looking for more money, or the mainstream just being completely apathetic to anything involving video games. I feel that this strike is an important one. It could set a precedent and a trend for the future of this entire industry that would improve things for everyone, not just voice actors, but also developers and the consumers. A high tide raises all boats, as they say. But so much of this entire issue is buried under misinformation or preconceptions. Anyway, I hope this video of mine at least informed a few people on what is admittedly a rather convoluted subject. And after all that, you still don't think SAG-AFTRA's in the right here? That's fine. It's more important for me to inform you for better discussion rather than you just blindly agreeing with me. If you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to type them in the comments below. And heck, while you're at it, why not go look up someone who's in your favorite game, be they a voice actor or someone on the development team, and see if you can't track them down on social media and send them a note saying how much you appreciate their work. With all that said, I'm Dan, here at SkillTree, signing off.